Hey guys, Ted here with Salty Cycles. Hey, today's video we're going to remove a Shimano crankset from a carbon fiber road bike. Now, some cranksets will come off differently. SRAM, FSA, there's other brands out there, Praxis. They all come off similarly. Not exactly how the Shimano sets do, but I know there's a lot of people out there with Shimano sets, so I thought I would do a video on how to remove a Shimano crankset. It's really easy. You're going to need just a few common tools, except for one tool, which if you've seen in my previous videos, I showed you my toolkit, and I told you I would show you what this tool is for, and we're going to use that today. That is to remove the dust cap on the non-drive side that helps hold your crank arm on. So hey, let's get started. Here we go. All right, so here we are. We've got the non-drive side of your Shimano crank. And on either side, you're gonna have a bolt that takes a 5mm hex key to loosen. So let's go ahead and do that. We've got our 5mm hex key here. Loosen those up. Now we don't need to completely remove them. We're just loosening them. If you would like to completely remove them, add some white lithium grease to it to avoid future corrosion. I think that's a great idea. I'm not going to do that. I've removed my crankset on a somewhat regular basis to do a thorough cleaning, and they already have white lithium grease. So now that we've got those two bolts backed off, we're going to take this dust cap here, and we're going to use this. There is no other tool involved. It's just your hand, because this does not need to be put on extremely tight. So when we reinstall, I'm going to re-emphasize that you don't want to over tighten this. It's a plastic piece that's threading into a metal crank arm. So the plastic threads are always going to give way first. And unless you just want to go out and rebuy some parts, like that little dust cap, I would strongly suggest not over tightening that. So now that we've got the two bolts and we've got the dust cap out, see if I can get you a really good shot of this. Right in between the crank arm, right in here, there is a piece, and I'm going to use this pick to show you. And see if I can pull that up. See that? See that little piece that I just pulled up right there? That little piece has to come up to be able to remove the crank arm. I'm going to show you why. See how that came off? So that little piece fits down into, let me see if I can get a light to show you a little better. So you see that hole in the spindle? Right there. That hole is there for the specific reason. Let's see if I can show you. When you push that down, inside of here, there's a little piece that extends down. Maybe you can see it right there. And it fits down into that hole. And if you don't push that little clip up, you just keep jamming on pulling that crank arm out, you're gonna break it. So it's really simple. Just take a flat screwdriver or a pick and you just push it up. And that's all you gotta do. Now don't fear, it goes all the way through this side, all the way to this side. And this rear bolt holds it in. If you take this bolt completely out, you can take that completely out if you wanted to. So at this point you can see on the back side of the crank arm, up against the frame. Again, I do this on a somewhat regular basis, but there's road grime. There's a lot of lube in here, and I do that to keep any water from getting into the threaded areas, from rusting. I also want to try to keep as much road grime and dirt out of my bearings. Now, On the newer road bikes, we use what's called a sealed bearing. And I will tell you, from having worked in the industrial market for over 15 years, sealed bearing is a misnomer. They are not sealed. You put a sealed bearing underwater, it will get water in it. Sealed simply means it's not like the old school ball bearings where the balls would fall out. It's inside of there, and there's a rubber seal on either side of that bearing, and they're pressed into place. It's pre-greased. So we're not having to, like in the old days, we're not having to pull these apart, pull out all the old grease and repack the ball bearings, which is a lifesaver, because if you've ever tried to take apart an old bike and rebuild it, those ball bearings are a nightmare. I'm grateful we have sealed bearings today. So once we've got that done, we want to get the crank off. Now, if you haven't taken your crank off ever or in a long time, this might be something you need, a rubber mallet. So what I've done is I've already taken the rear wheel off, as you can see, and I've got my chain in the smallest chain ring. I've taken it out of the big ring and I've put it in the small ring. So I'm going to grab hold of my frame, rubber mallet, not a metal hammer, rubber mallet. And I'm just going to give it one really solid hit right on the spindle. Okay, how about another one? All right, it's on there pretty good. There it goes. Now you can see it's now pretty much flush with the bike. So we've moved that spindle. See if I can get you a shot. So you can see here the crank is actually out away from the frame, and on this side the spindle is flush. So what I want to do now is I want to take the chain and I want to pull it off the crank, and the crank is going to slide right off. There you go. So you have now successfully removed your crank. It looks, let's see if I can get you a good backdrop. Looks something like that. There's nothing spectacular about it. It's pretty simple. So why would you do this? There's a couple of reasons. Maybe your bike is making a bunch of noise when you pedal. It's creaking, it's just cracking. Something doesn't sound right and it sounds like it's coming from the crank. Well, again, I do this on a pretty regular basis, and inevitably what I find is on the drive and non-drive side, I end up with a lot of just road grime and grit. And if you haven't ever done it, you might find that's it's just dry. And what you're hearing is just metal on metal or metal on plastic or plastic on plastic, and you're just getting this constant friction and it's just squeaking. It's not really hurting anything, but if you're like me, noises and creaks and cracks and squeaks drive me nuts. So this is a great opportunity to pull your crank off, clean this thoroughly, clean the frame, clean the mating surfaces, clean the inside as much as you can, clean the spindle, all the threaded portion, the spline portion where the crank arm is going to go back on, clean the inside of your crankset. Everything gets cleaned, and I prefer just simple green. Just a really simple degreaser. So that's what I'm going to do now, and as soon as I'm done with that, we'll be back to the video. All right, so everything is clean. The mating surfaces on both sides of the frame are clean. The non-drive crank side arm is clean. The crankset itself is clean. So what I want to do now is I want to reapply a little bit of grease. Park Tool. It's called Polylube 1000. You've seen me use this on previous videos. It's a great general purpose grease. So all I want to do is just want to squeeze a little bit of that out. Grab it with the finger. Take the part of the crank arm for the non-drive side that fits up against the frame. And I just want to put just a little bit on the crank arm itself, where it's going to be rubbing against my frame, just like that. I'm going to do the same thing here. Again, I'm not putting a ton, just putting grease on grease so that it avoids any creaking and cracking and rubbing. And I also want to put a little bit on the inside because this is where the crank spindle comes through. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. little bit on my finger. Come over to the mating side. I just want to put a little bit of grease on this plastic as well as on the inside of the bearing surface, so that when I push the crank arm or the crank spindle back through, it's all coated in grease. One thing that I like to do is put a little bit on the inside on what's called the splines. If you're not familiar with industrial, I guess, terminology, what you've got in there, all those little ribs are called splines. Now, it's a good point to point out, if you're worried about how do I know that I'm gonna put my crank arm back together where my drive side crank arm is here and my non-drive side is perfect? What if I put them wonky and they're not perfectly opposing? Well, Shimano's already thought of that for you, and the splines are made in such a way the crank arm will only go on one direction. I'm gonna see if I can get you a video or a picture of that. So can you see that bigger spline right there as opposed to all the other splines? That means your crank arm only goes on that way, which puts it perfectly opposing to the other one. It will not go on any other direction other than the way it's supposed to go. So again, if you're a little intimidated and you don't want to put it on wrong or crooked, Shimano's already thought of that for you, and they made it in such a way that it only goes on one direction. So the last thing I'm going to put some grease on is on the mating side of the crank arm itself, where it pushes up against the frame, and just a little bit on the spindle itself. So right on the spindle, because when I push that through the frame, some of that's going to get rubbed off, which is fine, and I want to put a little bit on the splines. Again, the biggest reason we're putting the grease is to prevent corrosion and to avoid friction and noise and creaking and cracking. So we're ready to put this thing back together. So let's move to the drive side and we'll put the crank arm back on. All right, here we go. So we got the crank, we got the spindle. First thing we want to do is pick the chain up, put the spindle inside the chain, slide the spindle into the frame, and then we want to put the chain back on the smallest chain ring, just like we had it before we took it off. And we just give it a good press. Just press it right up against the frame, and that side is done. Not that scary, right? Let's go to the other side. So here we have, the spindle is back through. It looks very similar to how it looked when we started taking this thing apart. So, crank arm is dropped straight down. Remember, because of the splines, this will only go back on one way, and it just slides right on. Give it a good push. Got our dust cap. Before we do that, remember that little tab that we popped down? We want to push it back in, and now the crank arm is not coming off because that little tab is keeping it in. Push it in, and we start threading the dust cap back on. One thing I will tell you, if the threads don't easily go in, back it out, do it again. Because if it's cross-threaded, if the threads aren't lined up just right, you will damage the threads on the plastic piece. So I'm threading this on, and what's happening is the spindle, right? The spindle is threaded, and as I'm threading in the dust cap, it's pulling them together. So you don't need to worry about squeezing the crank arm while you're trying to do this. That's what these threads are for. So here we go. Just finger tight, and I'm good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my 5mm, and I'm just going to tighten these up. I'm not over tightening at this point because I'm going to use my torque wrench to make sure that I've got it to the right tightness. I just want to slide these back in. Okay. Looks like I'll drop the chain off the, there we go. So we're just going to tighten those up. So on your crank arm, you may have a sticker that tells you how tight those bolts need to be. And more than likely, it's telling you in Newton meters. So if you see the term NM, that's called a Newton meter. So there's inch pounds, there's foot pounds, but a lot of times in the bike world, they talk about things in Newton meters. So mine says each of the bolts should be evenly and equally tightened to 12 to 14 Newton meters. So you want to know what Newton meters equals in inch pounds? Google will tell you. 12 inch pounds equals roughly 100, or 12 Newton meters equals roughly 105 inch pounds. So I've got my torque wrench, which you've seen me use in previous videos. I've got it set to 105 inch pounds. I put on a hex key. I start tightening it up. Again, evenly and equally, right? That means we're not tightening one side all the way down. We're going back and forth. You heard the click? That means we're there. Let's go to the other one. Hear the click? All right, we're there. Boom. That's it, guys. Shimano crank pulled off, cleaned, re-greased, put back on, and torqued back down to the specifications. There is nothing to be scared of here. This is really easy. It's almost impossible to mess up. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment. Look forward to the next video. Have a good one.